So I'd like to start by saying thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today, as you can see, we're discussing standard content in Onshape. And if you're not familiar with it, standard content is a recently released bit of functionality by Onshape that allows you to insert things like nuts and bolts and screws and washers into your assemblies. Very quick, very easy to use, and we wanted to put together a simple webinar discussing it. Now, this is going to be a short webinar. This is an easy topic, an easy thing to show you how to use and to insert all the various hardware that you need. But we really wanted to give an opportunity to you to ask any questions that you'd like about standard content. So use this as your opportunity. Feel free to type in any question that you'd like in the question section, the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that pop up about standard content as we go through today's webinar. So again, really like to make these as interactive as possible. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to answer them. But it's going to be a short webinar because, again, standard content, really simple to use. So let's get into it. Now, the agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to introduce standard content, the concept of standard content. So if you're not familiar with standard content as a term, just explain what it is, and then discuss how standard content differs in Onshape. So if you have experience with other, CAD systems that have existed, and you have experience with their quote-unquote, fastener libraries or standard content libraries, I want to discuss why Onshape's approach is a bit different. And there are a few different reasons why that I'll really point out in just a moment. And of course, show you a few examples of how it works. So if you haven't inserted standard content yet, I'll walk you through how to insert standard content, all the little details of using it, how to insert things very quickly, how to, adjust where things are in the bolt stack and so on. We're going to go through all of the, some of the more advanced capabilities of standard content as well. So I want to kind of round things out by just showing you some of the capabilities. We'll start simple with just inserting a simple bolt. But then we'll get into, how do I populate an entire face? How do I insert washers between the bolt and the nut, and, all those types of things. Again, feel free to ask any question that you'd like. There's a question section there in the GoToWebinar control panel. Ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer them as we go through things here. So that's our agenda. Let's start with a simple introduction into standard content. Now, what is standard content? And put simply, standard content is the ability to insert nuts, bolts, screws, and washers very easily from a standard library into the assembly. As of today, that's ANSI and ISO standards. All right, so as of the recording of this, January 30th, 2018, it's ANSI and ISO standards, but it's important to note we just announced standard content a few weeks ago, really. So nuts, bolts, screws, and washers, ANSI and ISO standard as of today. And these are inserted at the assembly level. So it's essentially a way to insert that standard, hardware, the standard library hardware that you might, refer to it as. Or I know in SolidWorks they have, the toolbox, which is a toolbox of standard hardware. Very similar concept, right? Nuts, bolts, screws, and washers. So to put it simply, this is a fast way for you to do those things with your assemblies, to insert those pieces of standard content. So that's what it is, and it's a new option available to everyone at the assembly level. So when you click Insert in the assembly, you will see a new option there at the top for standard content. So what I want to get into is why this is different than what you may have used in the past. If we look at something like SolidWorks, and SolidWorks is one system, but there are many. They often required a separate add-on or a separate package to use to have a library of nuts and bolts. Right? That was one thing that was often kind of a crux of this system, because if you worked in a team, in a company, and you wanted a library of nuts and bolts, everyone had to have the upgraded package or add-on. So that was one thing to consider. It always required a more expensive version typically to get this library of nuts and bolts. It also meant that each person had an independent set of files for their complete hardware library. For that toolbox, so to speak, there was a folder with a whole bunch of files in it. And the nature of that just led to a lot of headache, especially in an environment where you have more than one user. If you have multiple users and each one has their own independent set of files for their hardware library, it can be very cumbersome and can lead to a lot of confusion, especially considering if a change is made to part numbers or descriptions, for instance, in one set of files. It was not reflected anywhere else. And there were ways to get around this, but it required you to manage these libraries, and it required you to control that, and it required additional steps. And so it was always somewhat of a headache, especially in companies that wanted to share a hardware set. Right? If you wanted to share a set of nuts and bolts and have everyone use the same nuts and bolts, same part number, same description, so everything looked right on the BOM, it was always a troublesome thing. Right? So the key reason behind this is just the default nature of every CAD system coming installed with its own file base, so to speak, of hardware. And the changes made in one wouldn't be reflected anywhere. It caused all kinds of confusion, even to the point where you would have sometimes common scenarios in old CAD systems. You would open the assembly and the hardware would blow up. That's a common term, where the nuts and bolts would literally change size because the size exists in one library and not another, right? Because they're not shared. But also things to consider, it's the file-based nature of it was always a bad thing, but also just generally difficult to use. If you wanted to insert, washers into your bolt stack and have everything shift around and update, it often required you to start over with a different command or delete things. And it was just never a very easy to work with experience from the setup and configuration to its actual use. Right. So these are things that we set out to solve when we wanted to create standard content. When we look at the problems of old CAD systems, the file-based nature of it is a problem that's easy for us to solve. Right. In Onshape, everyone uses the same parts, the same metadata, and there's nothing that you have to do to set that up. There's nothing that you have to do to manage that. So these are just some of the examples, some of the things that I like to mention about the toolbox or the standard content approach of past CAD systems is just generally the file-based nature, the difficult to use nature of them made them somewhat avoided. You'll run into companies that didn't use these tools, the built-in tools at least, because of this. So just something to consider, and something that we thought quite a bit about when we set out to create standard content. So again, what's different? If we think about what Onshape has done versus what you've used in the past, the first thing I would point out is there's no special add-ons, packages. There's no special version of Onshape that gives you the standard content. Everyone has standard content today, and that means that you never have to worry about, is this person have the right version of Onshape so that they can see my nuts and bolts? Those kinds of things don't happen in Onshape because of that nature. The big thing I would stress, and this is especially important if you're in a company that wants to use a single library of nuts and bolts, in Onshape, each person in your company is using the same exact parts with the same exact metadata. And that is a really critical thing, and you don't have to do anything to set that up. That's default. So if you're inserting from standard content and you're a part of a company, it's going to have the same exact metadata. And I'll discuss how you change that in just a moment. But I do want to stress that because I know, again, the independent nature, each person having their own set of files just led to kind of chaos where you don't have that at all in Onshape. Right? And the other thing I would point out is just the nature of working with standard content is much easier in Onshape. You can insert and edit bolts and nuts, the stack, so to speak, very easy, and it will shift the parts around accordingly, right? And there's very little need to have to delete and reinsert when things will auto shift and things like that. The other thing I would say about Onshape's approach is each piece of standard content, each nut, bolt, washer, whatever it is, has a built-in mate connector. That mate connector makes it a one-click process to place a bolt into a hole, for example. So the design intent for the bolt, its attachment point, is a part of the design intent. And it's a part of each piece of hardware, which makes inserting it very, very simple. And it just means that the overall use of inserting these pieces of standard hardware, standard content, is much easier in Onshape. And that's something, again, that we really wanted to solve when you look back past CAD systems. All right, so let's get into standard content. I'm going to start simple, just with a simple explanation, inserting a simple bolt, explaining what everything does, and then we'll get into some of the more powerful things that you can do with standard content. Question. I have a base plate that has about 40 holes in it. Some are clearance, some are threaded. Later, looking over the holes, I second guess myself of what holes are threaded and of which are clearance. Is it possible to include in the future that Onshape could put a bitmap or some other graphic on the threaded holes to show which ones are which? Thank you. That is very good feedback. I will say that we have had that in the past, so it wouldn't surprise me to see that in an update in the future. I'm not personally aware of plans for a way to annotate differences in holes and things like that, even just a graphic to show the difference in holes. Use the feedback tool and let us know. That way we can gather number of feedback and prioritize, and we do that, reprioritize things quite often. But yeah, with the whole feature, the ability to show some sort of an annotation for threads, for instance, is not done at the model level. It's done at the drawing level today, correct? So definitely let us know if that's a high priority for you, and we can add you to that list of views. I know other users have asked for that. So, all right, so let's get into standard content, and I want to start by just inserting a simple bolt. And I want to insert a bolt into this globe valve as an example. Now, as I mentioned before, this is strictly for assembly. So in the insert dialog at the assembly, you will see an option here at the top for standard content. Right, the option here at the top for standard content. And then you could go through and define the standard, the category, the class, the component that you want. So in this case, as I mentioned before, 2 standards as of today, ANSI and ISO. I choose ISO. I want a bolt, right? A hex bolt, and I can specify what type of component from that list. So we have self-tapping screws, set screws. I'm not going to go through each combination of the different things, but I do want to mention again, change your standard, your category to whatever you'd like: bolts, screws, nuts, washers, the different categories or class within them, and then the individual components. Once you've done that, then you specify the size information for your standard content. What size do you want? In this case, this is metric. What bearing face, what length, right, and what thread length. And so these are all pulled from standards of nuts and bolts based on these sizes. But this is where you specify the independent, this bolt, in this case, here's the information I want. M16, 75 millimeters long, and so on. And you can get a little visual here of the thing that you're inserting. One big thing that I would point out is we have the ability to auto size. Auto size will allow you to select an edge or a cylindrical face, and it will grab the appropriate size for you, right? So we'll automatically pull the size from the geometry that you select. Now, it's not going to automatically insert. That's still a separate step, and I'll show you that in a moment. But if you don't know the size of this hole, you don't know what it should be, you can click auto size here, and then just click on an edge or a cylindrical face associated with the hole that you want to measure, essentially. And that's the way you can think of this. Click this, it measures the hole, and then grabs the appropriate size from the list based on your selection. So if you don't know the hole size, you don't know the bolt size that you need, auto size could be valuable for this. One question that has come up when we talk about standard content is, when we use something like auto size, does it matter if you used hole feature versus just did a cut extrude with a circle? The answer is no. It will work either way. So it will detect the hole diameter and work even if you just did a normal circle cut extrude, not using hole feature. But if you use hole feature, it will pull the right coarse versus fine thread definition for the hole. And I thought that was a useful thing to mention. So one big advantage of using hole feature is the hole has embedded information that determines its size, its pitch, and so on. And we'll pull that coarse versus fine pitch definition for the bolt, in our example at least, if you used hole feature to create it. So one big advantage that I wanted to point out with using hole feature, it will work in any scenario, so you don't have to use hole feature. But if you do, you get that added bonus of it being a little bit more intelligent about what hardware it chooses. So that is auto size. Definitely something that makes inserting these very easy. You don't have to go in and measure the size and then figure that out. But ultimately, it's just a matter of determining length, material, finish, any other details that you want, and then choosing the option to insert. So once I've defined, what standard, category, class, what are all the details of the piece of standard content that I want to insert, I click insert. And what will happen is a standard piece of content will be attached to your cursor. So after you click insert and you move your cursor out of the graphics, you'll see this piece of standard content, whatever you've chosen, in this case, a simple bolt. And as I move my cursor around, you can see it tries to attach to different things. As I mentioned earlier, every piece of standard content has a built-in mate connector. You can see it in the graphics there. That is its attachment point. And so each piece of standard content has that attachment point as part of its design intent in the actual part. And it's one of the benefits of doing this. If I want to insert a bolt into a hole, I click insert, I mouse over the hole that I want, I left click, and it's inserted. That's all it takes. So I don't have to insert and then go click mate, then select a combination of faces to mate everything into place. I literally just left click as I'm inserting into whatever hole I want. And so it automatically puts me into that snap mode behavior, if you're familiar with snap mode, and it places things as you move around. All I need to do is left click, and it not only places them in the assembly, but it also mates them into place. You can see here the fastened mate for the bolt in this scenario. So inserting and mating into place is just a matter of literally left clicking the thing where you want to place it. And as I move this around, let's say that I want to put one over here, left click. Now I've inserted a second bolt. You can see there's the mate, there's the bolt in the assembly into this design. Right. So inserting and mating is very, very simple. Just click insert, move your bolt to wherever you want to place it, left click when it's snapped into place, and it will insert and mate the standard content, in our example, the bolt, into place. So very, very simple. Again, I want to stress, you should be able to insert and mate everything without even leaving the insert dialog. You can see the insert dialog is still up here. And I can go right to the next thing that I wanted to insert. I don't have to accept, go back to the command. I don't have to insert into space and then mate into place as a separate step in the process. I should be able to just insert everything as I'm dragging and dropping, essentially. You can think of it that way. One big thing that I would point out, and it's going to be something inevitably that you'll run into, is you can also undo as a step in the process, right? So I can click the undo arrow. Again, I've never closed the insert dialog. I'm just clicking undo, and it's going to undo inserting all of those bolts. So you don't have to exit the command. You don't have to exit undo and then go back to the command. You can just click undo while still in the dialog, and it will undo the insertion of all of that. So one important tip I know for those out there that are just getting started with standard content, undo can be a very valuable tool when you're first getting started inserting bolts. All right, so we've discussed inserting single pieces of hardware, single pieces of standard content, right? So you just insert, move your mouse where you want to place it, left click, and it places it. Another tip is you can left click an edge or multiple edges, for instance, click insert, and it will also insert. So you can pre-select an edge, a circular edge, and it will insert a piece of standard content at that edge. You can pre-select multiple edges, right? So if I say for instance I wanted to put just 6 of the 8 holes I wanted hardware, I can pre-select those 6 edges, select insert, and it's going to put standard content in all of those edges. One thing I like to point out though, pre-selecting an edge is useful if you have just a couple of edges. But what if I had 24 holes and I want to insert all of them all at once? selecting individual edges isn't as practical in that scenario. So I'm going to click undo here, undo that last bolt. And what I want to point out here is the ability to select a face. So I showed you how you can just click insert and then move your mouse around and place it by left clicking. I showed you how you can select an edge and predefine where you want to put the bolt or piece of standard content. But you can also just select faces. And Onshape will look for holes in the faces that you select. So in addition to selecting edges or just clicking insert, you can click the faces first, click insert, and it will insert that piece of standard content in all holes in that face. Right? So if you have a lot of holes that you want to populate at once, that's the way to do it. Right? And the holes can be in multiple directions. It takes the normal direction of the face and determines that. So you don't have to worry too much about that kind of thing. But just keep in mind, again, if you have a lot of the same hole on a face, just select the face. And then you can insert all of those instances at once. Right. Question: can standard hardware be associated with a part number to be later shown on a BOM? Yes, I will show you that in just a moment, so bear with me. But yes, you can edit the part number associated with an individual piece of standard content, and more importantly, that part number will propagate to everyone in your company automatically. So yes, you can edit today part number and description, and you can give your standard content custom part number and description. I'll go over that in just a moment. How is thread pitch specified? That's a good question. We'll come back to that. Bear with me there. All right, so that's inserting simple nuts and bolts. All you do is you select standard content, choose your nut, bolt, screw, washer, whatever it is that you want to insert, and then choose one of those three methods that I showed you for inserting. If you have a lot to insert at once, just select faces, and that's the easiest way to do that, and then it will insert everything in that face. If you have just a few, selecting edges works really well. If you just have one or maybe two, inserting using click and then dragging and dropping into place is very practical. So it really depends on the scenario, how many that you have to insert, and so on. All right, so we've inserted the first of our hardware here. And one thing I want to point out is notice all of the icons here for all of the instances that we added to this assembly. So you can see they have a special or different icon than a normal part. It's a standard content part, and it has an icon to indicate that. So just keep that in mind. You will get that visual cue in the instance list. You can right-click and edit the instance, but you can't edit. No, I take that back. You can, as of the latest update, edit with the same configuration, right? So shift select or multiple selections of parts. But if you need to edit, it's just a matter of right-clicking, just like you would if it were a normally inserted part. You'll find it listed there in the instance list. Right? I want to clarify, just because I know it's going to come up, is there a way to change all hardware? In fact, I see the question already. How do you swap all hardware for a different size? Very good question. I think the answer today is you can't shift select and edit everything at once. Let me try this, double check. I do know as of a few weeks ago, this was a limitation. I take that back. I'm sorry. So to be clear, you can edit a few of these, for instance. Let's say that I wanted to edit a dozen, and I shift select, right click. You'll see edit standard content instance in the right click menu, and you can choose to change the length, for instance, of them. Make sure to click update when you're done, and it will update all of them. When we initially launched, this was a limitation, but it's no longer the case. So you can shift select a whole bunch of pieces of standard content that you've inserted and change them. Now, you won't be able to change a bolt to a washer or vice versa. You're only going to be able to change things like size and length and so on, but you can shift select or control select a number of them at once. I know that was a question that was asked a lot very early on. All right, so I missed a few questions. How do you swap all hardware for a different size? That's what I would use. I would shift select all of them, right click, and edit the standard content instance. I freelance for a few different companies. How can I ensure that I'm using their hardware part numbers since they each will have their own? Unfortunately, I don't think we have an elegant solution to that today. Right now, you can change them on the fly but you're going to have to remember different. I don't know that we have an elegant solution for the scenario where I need multiple different part numbers for the same hardware. Again, as of today. Can you insert washers out now, or do you have to undo the bolts first? No. And I'm going to show you an example of this. And the key to that is the insert closest to and furthest from options, which I'll go over in just a minute, so bear with me. If your surface has other holes, can you select a patterned hole feature? No. Very good question. So if your surface has other holes, the example I gave you, I select the face and every hole in that face gets a piece of standard content. But what if you had multiple different size holes all on the same face? That's an example where I personally would select individual edges because you're right. There's no way today to select just holes of all the same size at least is the way I'm aware of. So you just select a face and it grabs every hole in that face. That is something that we should definitely use the feedback tool and let us know. Obviously, we're aware of of that, but use that feedback tool and let us know what you think would be a good solution to that. As of today, I would select individual edges. You may even be able to use a create selection to select those edges, and then use that to define your standard content. So there may be an elegant solution in there using a combination of those things. Supposing you wanted to add washers to all those holes and then add bolts to the washers, can you use the face placement options to stack those items? Yes. I will go over that in just a second. In fact, we're here, so let's go over the example of the bolt. What if you forgot to put washers first? I'll show you an example of that. Bear with me. Is there a way to hide show all mate connectors at once? Yes, right click on one of them and choose hide all mate connectors. Right, so if you right click on any mate connector, you'll have that option to hide all. Can standard component material selection be linked to a custom material library? No. No, I think it's a static list as of today. Forgive me. I'm fairly certain it's just a list of a few options that isn't linked to custom materials. We do have the ability to have custom materials in Onshape, but the integration or tying a custom material to standard content, I think, is going to be the limitation. So forgive me if I'm misunderstanding that question. I found it difficult to insert a flathead screw into a countersunk hole. Forgive me, I'll have to try an example of that. It may be a scenario where the mate connection points that are automatically determined aren't ideal. And you can edit the mate and shift things around using a normal, offsets and things if you run into that. Yeah, that's probably off the top of my head the best solution that I have, so forgive me. What will the mates stay if a part, says the orange font, is swapped out, assuming the size and number of holes remain the same? Yes. I don't see any reason why it would update. What is the future intent for standard content option? Is the library of options growing? Absolutely. So it's important to keep in mind this is only a few weeks old now. So we've only had standard content for a few weeks now. We're working hard on improvements currently, and we're going to keep working hard. And that's part of the reason why we do these webinars. These questions really drive a lot of the feedback. Using the feedback tool and letting us know, that really gauges where our priorities should be with regards to standard content. So really encourage you, use the feedback tool, ask any questions you like as you are. We value all of it. So, can users add to standard content? No. Not as of today. Today, it's a fixed library of parts, according to those two standards that we talked about. That is something that we're very aware of the need for. The ability to have custom standard content. And what I would say today is you can do this with, by putting your standard content in a document, versioning it, and you can even insert your own mate connectors, like the nuts and bolts that you see here today. But there's no way today to add to standard content, Onshape's functionality for standard content. I hope that's clear. All right, so that is inserting simple bolts, and I wanted to discuss inserting nuts as well. And so if we go back to standard content and I choose nut, I can choose, again, all the details for the nut that I want, choose the size that I want, or just use auto size, as we mentioned earlier. And then I can just click the faces where I want to put the nut. Now, in the past example, I clicked the faces where I wanted to put the bolts. And this example, I'm clicking the face where the nut should go. Right? And remember, this is very important because it uses that mate connector to attach to the thing that you're selecting. And that's kind of intrinsic in how it works, right? It's an important part of how it works. So I click insert, and it inserts the nuts at those faces, right? But I did not select, and this is a question that came up, this original face. I selected this face to place the bolts because notice where the mate connection point is on bolts. But nuts, again, I would select this face because, here's where that nut attaches, right? All right, so that is inserting nuts, and it's the same exact process essentially as inserting the bolts. You're just choosing the face where the nut should butt up against. Now, inevitably, this leads to the question of washers, and how do I incorporate washers into this scenario? And the answer is closest to and furthest from the stack. So when you go into standard content, there are two options here at the very bottom, and you can't select them by default. These only work if you have a face selected. And that face is important because that's how it knows where the furthest and closest reference is. So we have closest to and furthest from your selection. And I'm going to go over an example of these in a bit because these are critical if you're doing that bolt stack where it's, plain washer, lock washer, nut. And the order there is very, very important. All right. That's where closest to, furthest from is going to be really, really critical. So jumping back here, let's go back to our slide deck just briefly. Closest to, furthest from is especially important in the scenario bolt stacks. If all you have is just a bolt and even just a simple nut, you can do what we just did, just select faces. But if you start incorporating multiple layers to this, then closest to, furthest from becomes very important. So washers and nuts, when you're using a combination of washers and nuts, the order there is really critical, and getting that right is really important. So it's important to understand this. Closest to inserts the standard content, whatever you've chosen, whether it's a washer or a nut, it inserts it closest to your selection. Closest to your selection in whatever bolt stack you have already. So if I select a face of a part, it's going to insert, if I choose closest to, right on the face of the part that I select in the bolt stack that exists already. But if I choose insert farthest from, right, it's going to insert that piece of standard content furthest out in the stack of standard content away from the face I select. So in the screenshot that I have there, you see plain washer, lock washer, nut, and those three in that order. And if you use a kind of an imaginary face where that plain washer sits up against, the plain washer would be closest to, and then I would insert the lock washer furthest from the selection after that, and then I would insert the nut furthest from the selection after that. Right? I'm going to go over an example of this, so forgive me if it doesn't make sense quite yet, but the closest to and furthest from selections is really critical to getting that order just right. Right? All right, so let's get into it. Now, the example, bear with me here, that I have for you is to this concrete bucket. What I want is a bolt that goes through, and I want that plain washer, lock washer, nut combination, and done in a clean way, right? So we can choose insert. We'll go to standard content. Let's choose in this case inch, and we can choose. And by the way, knew I wasn't missing something. In inch, you can see here's our coarse versus fine thread definition. I can choose coarse. I can also auto size, of course, as I mentioned earlier. But then I can insert. And I can insert and drop this into my assembly like so. So now I've inserted the bolt, but I forgot to insert the washer. How do I insert that flat washer between the bolt and the part that I'm fastening together? And so I could go to washer. Right, let's choose washer, type a plain washer. Well, those details are fine. I'll select a face, and then I can choose closest to or furthest from. It's really important to stress these two options will not be available until you click a face. That's how it knows what you're referencing. So I can then choose, okay, I want closest to my selection. And it will shift the bolt away to accommodate the washer in this scenario. And that's one of the benefits of doing this, is the fact that it's intelligent enough to know, okay, I need to offset the bolt to accommodate for that. So really important to stress, again, because the washer is closest to the face that I select, that's where it gets inserted in the stack. And of course, in this scenario, that's where it makes the most sense. Let's go to another example of this. Let's insert a washer here, and let's say that I want to insert next to this flat washer a lock washer, right? So I go into and choose my spring lock washer, right? We choose our size, any details that we want, and then I select the face, and in this scenario, I don't want closest to. If I choose closest to, I end up with a combination that starts with a lock washer, then goes to a flat washer, then goes to a nut, and that's not really what I want. What I want is flat washer, lock washer, nut. In that scenario, it wouldn't be closest to, it would be furthest from the selection. In other words, furthest from the face that I've clicked on. Right? So I choose furthest from the selection, and you can see it inserts that spring lock washer out in the stack, away from the selection that I made. So I hope that's clear. Furthest from, closest to are very critical elements to it. Inserting the nut is another great example. I'd choose nut. I would choose the details of the nut, whatever it may be, click the face, and choose furthest from, and that would put it all the way out on the end of that stack of hardware. So just keep that in mind as you're you're doing this. That furthest from is furthest from whatever face you click on. And that's how it figures out how to adjust. And it knows where that make connection point is because of that make connector. And that's what allows it to do this in a very intelligent way. And you don't have to do this all at once. If you want to come back later and realize you need to insert a washer, you can do that. Right. So, but just keep that in mind. The getting that bolt stack right with the left to right and the order correct, it's really the closest to and furthest from options. That's kind of the key to it all. All right, so questions. Can you select the metric profile since some bolts of the same size can have different pitches? Can you select the metric profile since some bolts of the same size can have different pitches? I don't know. Let me go to ISO. Let's choose. See, if I go to ISO nuts, it's just the standard list sizes. There's no coarse versus fine definition. In this case, it's only in the ANSI standard that I see that. It may not be the case throughout all standard content, so forgive me, I haven't looked that closely, but I do know that in the case of ANSI, you can specify coarse versus fine, and it should grab that if you used whole feature and select the whole for your definition. Can you select the washer face or just the part face? So the question comes up, can you select the face of the washer rather than the part face? And to be honest, I don't know. I haven't tried it. I'd have to try it to be certain. If you stick around, I can give it a shot. So it's best to use a face for the selection, correct? In fact, if you don't use a face, these icons are grayed out. These two icons, in fact, you can see right now I don't have any face selected. I can't click these two icons until I have a face selected. So, is it furthest from the latest part introduced? I'm thinking of grounding stud, which would have a series of plain sprung nut, order in this order. It would be furthest from the face selection that you make. So you would want to make a face selection on the furthest part out. in your example. So when you go to insert standard content, make sure to choose the face on the furthest end if that's where you want the hardware to start. It sounds like that would be the case. It's not the latest part, it's whatever face. The face is really critical. Metric fasteners is also, of course, in fine threads. Would you please update the standard content so the common course and fine threads for metric sizes are also listed? Yes. Use the feedback tool and let us know if you find any other sizes are really critical to you. If there are any other standards that are really critical to you, let us know and prioritize them so that we know, our users' priorities. We really take that seriously. So we really value the feedback here, but also use that feedback tool and let us know. How can I change the order of nuts and washers afterwards? Good question. Delete and reinsert essentially is the answer. If you wanted to move, well, I guess technically you could move the mates around if you wanted to, but I think it would almost be faster to delete and reinsert in that scenario. If you wanted to reorder this later, I would probably just delete and reinsert. Anything else would probably take longer than deleting and reinserting. All right, so that is closest to and furthest from. I really wanted to get that explained as best I could because I think that it's an important part of that bolt stack combination. And so if you are using those commonly, getting that combination right is really important. I'd say use the rollback feature so you only delete one and reinsert one. Yes, you can. You can undo too. A good point. You can undo if you've just recently done it. If you can go back to the history if you've done that, but it's fairly fast to reinsert as well. All right, so that is the insertion of basic hardware, and I hope I've covered that in great detail. I think it's fairly straightforward. What I want to get into next is the part numbers and descriptions, and I think that's really important for those that are building accurate bill of materials. If you're taking the information that you insert here and you're trying to use that to generate a true parts list that can be used to make orders and things like that, then getting the number of nuts and bolts and washers into the BOM is an important thing. It's an important detail. And so the big thing I would stress about this is, getting all of that metadata in is very easy. As of today, you can edit part number and description of any piece of standard content that you insert, and it will propagate automatically throughout your company. One of the biggest struggles of the toolbox style standard content libraries is that each person has their own fastener libraries. So if one person changes a part number, it's not reflected anywhere else. And so every person kind of has their own custom metadata for their own libraries. It can lead to chaos unless otherwise worked around. Whereas in Onshape, if I edit the part number and description and I start typing in PN dash, I'm just making up a part number here, and description, let's call this the half 13 stainless hex nut. Right. Again, I'm just making these values up, but part number, description, I click save. This is the company-wide thing. So the moment I click save, that part number, that description is automatically deployed to anyone in the company that inserts that piece of standard content. So it's a really important thing downstream when we start talking about the bill of materials, having the correct quantity, the correct part numbers and things, especially if you aim to go directly to some kind of billing software, something that the bill of materials is an actionable thing. These are important, right? Whether you use McMaster-Card numbers, you have your own part numbers, whatever the example is, here's how you customize that part number and description. So just an important tip, in the insert, as you're inserting, you have the option to edit the part number description. And you don't have to do this every single time. It's remembered, so to speak, so that when I come back and insert this combination of hardware later, these things will be remembered. Right. So as of today, it's just part number description, but this is something that we're looking for feedback on. So let us know. But it is something, again, that you really don't have to worry about deploying it, so to speak. Right. So it works similar to EPDM systems and Toolbox on server. Maybe the combination of the two, yes, where you have that centralized place managed by a data management system. Correct, yeah. But if you think of a default SolidWorks installation, that's not the case, right? Every person has their own individual. So it depends on the scenario. If you have something like an EPDM system managing, then there may be a little bit better answer to this. Of course, I would say our solution is automatically deployed with no management required. Right, so you don't have to do anything special to set up the fact that the part number description is deployed to the company. You just punch it in. Okay, so that's a simple intro into standard content. I think it's a relatively simple topic. I wanted to get into as much detail as I could. So I know we've taken nearly the entire hour here. I would definitely like any questions, any feedback that you have. So continue to ask those questions. I am going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. So feel free to ask any question that you'd like in the questions. I will make sure to get to all of them as I can. One final thing that I wanted to mention about standard content in Onshape, again, just to reiterate, is everyone in Onshape has standard content. So there's no special packages, no installs, no upgrades that are required. If you go to the assembly, you click insert, there's now an option for standard content. You have no files to maintain, you have no configuration, no EPDM necessary. It just works, and it doesn't require any kind of setup on your part. The biggest thing is, by default, with no action, of your own, no management of your own, everyone in your company is using the same exact parts with the same exact metadata. And that's a key thing to stress in companies or teams where that can often be, chaotic. And of course, in typical Onshape fashion, it's just easy to use. It's very simple to use. The closest to, furthest from means that I can insert washers into bolt stacks after I place the bolts or the nuts. So if I later realize I made a mistake, I'm not forced to delete and reinsert if all I need to do is shift things around or move, things out, for instance. So in general, we've really tried hard to make it easy to use. So these are some of the advantages that I would point out about standard content in Onshape. But let us know. Give us your feedback. If you have any questions, type them into the questions section there. I will make sure to answer all the questions before we wrap things up here. One final comment that I had is, if you're interested in learning more about Onshape, we really recommend checking out the Onshape Learning Center. You'll find it at learn.onshape.com. There's self-paced training for you, instructor-led training, even technical briefings on various topics. So lots of great learning resources available if you're interested. Learn.onshape.com. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to stick around and answer all questions. Feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. But that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.